Good morning. Good morning, good afternoon, and good night. Again, once depending where you are. Can you hear me well there? I hope you can.
Yeah, all good.
Good. So I'm just going to share my screen and start with a few slides. Let me just put a few things away. Don't never know where to put these things around. Okay. So, and again, this rate. So I'm going to talk about a bit of repeated measures, obviously mostly focus in analysis of breeding trials, but again, this applies to many other type of studies. It's as a complex linear mixed model as it can get, because what we have to deal with some correlation. In this case, is a temporal correlation because we are measuring the same experimental unit over time. In the case of breeding trials, this has potentially lots of benefits. We measure some perennials such as trees or cocoa or coffee several times, and often we want to analyze obtain the breeding values, combining all the information we have. And something similar happens when we deal with some crops, particular forage that you harvest several times. And then obviously within the season, you want to combine all that information to rank the genotypes and so on. So, but there is a few things that happen. First, I just want to start with a little bit of a definition. We talk about repeated measures. Sometimes you might hear longitudinal data analysis, which is most of the medical term used for this. And what we have is we have an experimental unit, which is measured over time. And the experimental unit I like to think about might be a plot that we are harvesting over time, or it might be a plant that we are measuring the height or something related to it over time. And that means it's the same unit that we are observing, and we have records on equally spaced or unequally spaced points over this time. And they are obviously not going to be independent. We have some correlation. This is a temporal correlation, and this is because we expect that observations close on time will be highly correlated or more correlated than observations that are farther apart on time. And that's where we talk about the decay of the correlation as we move away from one reference point. This lack of independence is what is the main focus that we need to deal with. We need to kind of focus on defining the correct structure of the residuals that model this lack of independence. And then with the rest of the model, we can do pretty much whatever we want. So if we are interested in comparing different times before and after a treatment, or a different harvest, 1, 2, 3, 4, or the average of the harvest, that is mostly like the part we deal with the fixed effects. But in terms of the residual part, the focus is really to model this temporal correlation. And we have different options. The most typical one we can think about it is the autoregressive of order 1. If you go to the geospatial statistics, you will find lots of other potential structures to measure correlation. But in terms of temporal analysis, this is the one that we tend to use most of the time. And we can get it a bit more complicated if we don't have too many time points. But autoregressive is the one that we use most often, and it's widely accepted. We also have to think about what happens with the time points in terms of with the means of the effects. And you can see here a plot. We might be interested of the mean of a progress of a treatment over time or a genotype over time. And that means also we need to think how we're going to model those being fixed or random effects. Now, the means of over times, sometimes you fit it as a covariable, and sometimes you hit it as a factor. And this is what it brings me to this slide, that we have two ways to treat time. One way to treat time is as a continuous variable, and then we will try to model the trend over time. That might be for a specific treatment, or it might be for overall, or it might be by treatment. And we can do that using polynomials, splines, some transformations of the responses, and so on, whatever you feel it's important for you to describe that trend. But often, we also analyze time as a factor. And that means a factor is just time 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We don't care too much if there is an actual trend on it or a decay or something that increases. There are just different time points, and we tend to model each of them. This is typically what we consider in the repeated measures analysis for plant breeding. We have our harvest, and we are interested on an average across the harvest or an average across the years where we measure. So that's where I'm going to kind of focus here. When you deal more with a covariate, you are more in the topic of the random regression, which I talked before about it. Yeah. Now we have two types of analysis we can do. We can always think about when you have the multiple harvests, on analyze that as a multivariate analysis, and that as a multi-trait almost, where we have one vector associated with each of the traits, and you can analyze that one as just any other multi-trait analysis with the caveats of different correlation structures like a core H or a core GH, and with the issues about the potential convergency issues that we have talked before. But the other way is to have it as stacked vectors, and this is the univariate way where we have our response, and somewhere in our response we have the time as another factor to describe that response. And that is the most typical way to analyze this type of data. Convergence issues are always going to be present. And one of the things that you need to consider is when you model this, you can really get very complicated with the correlation structure and even some of the other random effects. But notice that your focus often is not in that correlation structure, it's on the fixed effect or some relevant treatment effect that could be random, like genotypes. So the correlation structure that we think that we need to model, think about something that is a bit more secondary. We just want that to be reasonable, to give us correct degrees of freedom, reasonable, correct inferences, and so on by modeling this correlation structure, but our focus is on the rest. I have here the most typical autocorrelation are AR1. You can see this is time points. As time points get farther away, you can see that the correlation tends to drop, and there's different ways. And this is the typical decay from an autoregressive with some correlation that drops over time as you move with the units farther apart. At some point, we'll get to zero with a typical parameterization of the autocorrelation, and that's saying observations that are very far apart on time, they are uncorrelated. And sometimes you have another assumption, which is even if they're far apart on time, they will still be correlated. And this is where you add an extra element to your autocorrelation. There's a lot of different topics on this and so on. So I'm going to talk about a data set that was provided by some collaborators from the University of Florida. This is an alfalfa study. We have the genotypic performance of different harvests of alfalfa. In this case, it's dry matter yield. Over several harvests, there's a total of 11 harvests that were done between April 2018 and March 2019. They were done around every other month, but it's not necessarily equally distant. So we have different dates where they were done. This breeding trial has 177 entries or families. There's different groups of families, and they were planted in plots by family. So I'm just going to consider the 177 as genetic units, okay? And that has implications of how do we later consider, for example, genomic matrices, so we don't consider genomic matrices and so on. But for this moment, I'm going to have 177 genotype entries. The design was a p-rep design, so some of the genotypes were replicated more often, and it was a row column design where they were arranged with 3 additional controls. And as it says here, 20 seedlings per family were planted in 2 rows, and they were harvested these 11 times. Now you can see here a little bit of the trend of all the observations. You can see a lot of variability at the beginning, which is something usually we expect. The plants are still growing, and we have a really some noise in the first few harvests, and then it seems to get a bit more stable with actually a drop of the mean and then an increase as the season progresses. And this is a little over a year. And again, you can see variability, some lines or some, in this case, points that in this particular case are plots that go up and down. And it's not really a linear, and my objective is not define a linear trend on this, okay? So what I'm going to do is first focus on as many of these things in a single analysis for each of the harvests, clean the data, assess if we have some heritability, if we're dealing with a genetic effect, or if we have a significance of some of the effects, if we're dealing with treatments, look for outliers, look for assumptions, and somehow get also some starting values in terms of variance components and so on, and what elements are really relevant, maybe some covariables and so on. And here you have a model where we might have some fixed effect, which usually will be a rep effect. Then I have another set of fixed effects. In this particular case, I'm going to consider the genotypes as a fixed effect, some set of random effects. If we have an incomplete block, I will consider the incomplete blocks in this part. We may have row and column designs associated as incomplete blocks, etc. And then I have the error. So this is a simple analysis for a single measurement, and we assess what happens to it. Then we move this to consider multiple measurements. And there's different models that we can do where we expand this to multiple measurements. This is the model that we call usually compound symmetry. In some literature, you see it as a split plot approach, where actually what it does, it models in a very simplistic way the correlation between observations, in this case, between observations on the same experimental unit. And I'll show you what happens here. So first, let's think about the model. We're going to extend this model to multiple measurements. So now I have a mean for each of the t. The t is the time points. It's a factor. So this point, the time points, measurement, harvest, whatever name you want to use. So it's a fixed effect of that. We have a fixed effect associated with the design. So in this case, rep nested within the time points. There's rep effects on time point 1, different than rep effects on time point 2, and so on. My main effect of genotype, in this case, is across all the harvests as a fixed effect, and the interaction of genotype by time. This is my, obviously, variability that exists across the harvest. Sometimes you can think about lack of fit, or the G by time interaction, or genotype by time interaction. And then we have another set of random effects. I talk about row or columns or incomplete blocks nested within each of the time points. And this is very important. We respect the original design, and we allowed variance component associated for each of the different time points on whatever random effects they have. And here it becomes the most important element for this sort of simplistic model is the random effect of the experimental unit. And I use the letter U to denote that we have an experimental unit that is measured over the different harvest, and we consider this as a random effect. When we do that as a random effect, what we're saying is that of the observations that belong to the same level of a given unit, let's say plot number 10, are going to have a correlation. The correlation is going to be a uniform correlation, or a compound symmetry. That means every pair of observations is going to have the same correlation regardless of how far apart they are. Now that's not the best assumption, but if you only have 2 or 3 measurements, maybe it's a reasonable assumption. If you have 15, 20, or 50, then you don't have that decay of the correlation, and this is not really a very good model. But it's a simplification, and it's a good way to start, and it's a model that will always converge. The other thing I need to mention is that the errors, we have to consider the errors to be heterogeneous, because not all the harvests or the time points will have the same variance, and this is very typical to happen. In some cases, it will go up, the variances. In some cases, it will oscillate depending on what process you have. Okay. Now, I can also move that to a model that is an autoregressive model, which is the most traditional and the one that I tend to support for this type of analysis. Notice that I don't have the plot effect, but you could have it because it adds a different dimension. But if you don't have the plot effect or the experimental unit effect, this autoregressive is being modeled through the error term. Now, the errors are not independent. We're going to say the errors will have some structure, and that means the structure means that all the observations within the same experimental unit are going to be correlated with an autoregressive form, but we can use other ones to make things a bit more complicated. Now, it's important to note, and I still haven't shown you anything about the data yet, but that we'll use a Kronecker product to denote this correlation between observations. Notice the A matrix. We'll assume the A matrix is my experimental units, 1, 2, 3. They are independent from each other, but actually what we say is that the observations on the different types of observation of the experimental unit 1 are correlated, and we correlate this with this other component, which is the time or the harvest term. And notice I just put A, B, and C, but we can have any different structures of matrices. And this A, B, and C is going to be repeated here as many times as we have units, and the dimension of that is going to be blow up for as many time points that we have. In this case, we only have 2 time points, just to illustrate. And then you have this 2 by 2, and then you see that the matrix B multiplies the A, and then you have almost like an independent or diagonal matrix formed by these matrices that define correlations between observations in the same experimental unit. We have to pick which one is this B matrix, and we have several options. I mentioned about the compound symmetry, which assumes a common correlation between observations. And also we have the autoregressive, which is shown here, where you have actually the exponential happens to be the separation on the jumps between harvest 1 and harvest 2, harvest 1 and harvest 3, harvest 1 and harvest 4, and so on. And we have other structures that are more generic, and I'll come back to that. So let's just go and look at the data after all that sort of interaction, 20 minutes of interaction. I'm just going to directly start showing you a little bit of what happens with this data. I'm just going to read the data, is REML, and I set up some options in REML. I'm going to read my data, and you can see here I have an individual ID, the number of the harvest, rows and columns, and this is another indicator what type of family we have. We have some fillers and controls and so on. This is the genetic level, which is identified again with gen, so I'll use the column gen. The plot is the experimental unit that we have, that is the one that is going to be unique. So there's 11 observations for plot 1001. And in this case is the observation of time 0 when the day 0 of the experiment on the first harvest. And we have some NAs, of course, and the dry matter yield. One thing that is very important here is that we need to have the same number of observations for each of the harvests. So ACE REML will require that the harvest 1 has the same dimension as harvest 2, harvest 3, and harvest 4. And that means each plot has to be replicated 11 times, okay? So we have some dimension of the matrix. I'm going to make some factors: harvest, row, column, genotype, and plot. And just for simplicity, so we don't get numbers that are too large, I'm just going to, instead of using kilograms per hectare for the yield, I'm going to use tons per hectare just to make the numbers a bit smaller. Now, this is a summary table of the harvest, 1 through 11, and here you have the day from the beginning of the experiment, 0, 67, 96. So you have 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, and so on. So you have some of them. These are days, so they're not equally spaced, but they're close to be equally spaced, except for the first jump. I have here a table where it tells me how many copies of each of my genetic entries I have per harvest. And you can see each genotype obviously is in all the harvests because I made sure they were there. And if they die, you just replace them by NA. But some genotypes are with 3 copies, some of them are with 1 copy, some of them are with 2 copies. This is the partially replicated that we have for this experimental design. Now, a few more things. We can look at the means. The means of the different time points change and kind of like go up and then down and then up again. The variances also seem to have some patterns that they go up, down, and up. This is important because that means we need heterogeneity of variances. And here I'm just showing you the same plot that we had before on the slides. So first thing is to do an analysis. I'm just going to analyze harvest number 11. My model is relatively simple. I have a random effect of row, a random effect of column, big part of the design, and my genotype. In this case, I have it as a random effect, so I can calculate a heritability. You can also have it as fixed effect if you want it, and then look at an ANOVA table and decide if that's significant or not significant. I have simple independent errors, so I'm just going to model that. And my idea is to assess how my residual plots look, and I seem to have some observations that are a little bit too high here. Maybe I want to eliminate some of them. Again, you can look at the variance components. They seem relatively reasonable. I calculate a family heritability, which is just this 0.07, which doesn't seem to be very high in this particular case. Again, it's a family heritability, so we can assess what happens with it on this particular time, okay? And I can get some predictions, which means this is the LS means, kind of like the LS means for each of the genotypes, and assess and maybe look at something or hope that, for example, the controls are where they should be. Now, there's a few outliers, and this is a few lines here just for me to help me identify the outliers. And you won't see this, but I already did some cleaning of the data, so I'm just going to eliminate a few observations that were a bit odd. Again, you can use different criteria, but I have a group of around 10 observations that I decided to eliminate and make it NAs, okay? So now I'm ready to do my repeated measures analysis. You need to make sure everything is ordered. So I'm going to order by harvest and by plot. Again, this is something ASRM will require, particularly by harvest, because I'm going to make heterogeneous errors by harvest. So now I'm ready to expand my model. And just as a baseline, I'm going to consider independent errors, and I'm just going to consider an heterogeneous residual terms, one per harvest. So let's see what's happening here. This is my mean of harvest as a fixed effect. I'm thinking of genotype as a fixed effect now. So I have genotype as a fixed effect, and I have harvest by genotype as a fixed effect, an interaction. So this is A plus B, A two dots B. Not difficult there. Now I'm going to have row and column effects for each of the harvests, and I make those actually, I make those obviously random effects, and I make them individual for each of the harvests to respect their independent scales and whatever do they have, and also residual terms for each of different harvests. So I use the direct sum here with the units separated by harvest. Okay, my analysis will take a little bit longer. I mean, it's not excessive amounts of data, but we are asking for several variance components, actually something like 33 variance components on all of this. Again, once this fit, you can decide to make an update and make a few iterations. It's not a bad idea to look at the residual plots again. This is going to be a residual plots conformed by 11 different points. So we can see here still a few observations on some of the harvests that seem to be a bit off. And then we can explore the other plots that we have from ASRM, again, to identify where those potentially extra observations are. If we have we don't have anything weird, maybe 1 point here, maybe 1 point here, something that tells me that something is going on. But in general, they look relatively healthy. And also you can see these QQ plots with maybe a couple of observations here and there if you get picky and decide to eliminate those. But overall, it's very healthy data. I already eliminated some things. Now, this analysis is obviously incomplete because it assumes the errors are independent. But you can see here the different variance components of row, column, and the error terms as they seem very good, no issues. So I'm happy to continue with this. I can use those even as starting values if that's what I wanted. Now I'm going to model my simple compound symmetry. And this is like the easy way if you need to get away from it. And actually, if you don't want to model the autocorrelation structure, or maybe even you're going to do like a bivariate analysis, or where you have some more complicated residual components, this is a good way to get some correction from this lack of independency, but still be reasonable enough that you can do your other more complicated models. These are all the observations from plot number 10, or I could look at even, I think, plot number, no, 1000. Plot number, well, we can do 13. So you see, these are all the observations from one experimental unit. They are complete, and they're always 11. You might have some response variable. This is 13, happens to be actually the filler, which is all missing, but it's okay. Well, I couldn't get the 14, so let me just get the 11 now. and you see some response variable, some dry matter if you have it. So I'm just keep picking fillers, but that's okay. But the key here is to take my same models as before, and I add this plot term that it has to be a factor. So I need to define it as a factor. And if you don't have a plot, you might have the ID, experimental unit ID. You might have the tree, if you are dealing with trees, that is the unit that is being replicated, okay? And sometimes it happens to be that you might have trees within a plot, then you need to put the plot effect as a random effect by harvest, and then you need to put the tree as a random effect. But notice that I'm not separating by harvest or anything, because this is the one that models that correlation between observations that belong to the same level of a plot. Okay, the model will take a little bit longer. We might need to do a little bit of an update, and the magnitude of that plot effect is going to tell me, if it's very large in relationship to the error variance or the total variance, is going to tell you what is the level of correlation that you have on observations that belong to the same plot. Okay, so it has done some iterations. I could ask for a few more iterations. I'm not going to worry too much about it. You have your plot effect here, which seems to be relatively large in comparisons to the error variances from the rest. You can actually take the average of this, and then you have the plot variance divided by the sum of the plot variance by this, and that gives you an estimation of the temporal correlation that you have in your model. Okay, so, and in this case, it's not going to be a bad magnitude, and we expect it to be high and positive on this analysis because we're dealing harvest over time on something that is not too far apart. It's 30 days apart. Okay. Now, I can now change these independent errors to a model on which I model the autoregressive structure, and the key on this is the same key of associated with this Kronecker product. We define a matrix that has the correlation that we have across time points, and that's Kronecker product with a matrix of our experimental units. And I have it here the other way around, but it's the same logic. I have here a matrix of independent plots. So remember, I have each of these is an experimental unit. I'm going to say these experimental units are independent from each other, which is, I'm pretty much saying this. I'm using ID, and I'm going to say the matrix associated with the harvest is going to be an autoregressive of error order 1 for the 11 harvests. So it's going to be a 11 by 11 matrix that is going to have the H, which means it's heterogeneous. So it's not only going to say, I'm going here, you have a different correlation that depends on the jumps, in this case on the numbers of harvests. This is harvest 1 against harvest 2, there's 1 jump. Harvest 1 against harvest 3 is 2 jumps, and so on. So what you do here, you model this, but also you allow for the errors to be heterogeneous for each of these different harvests or time points. Okay, that is a good extension, and you will see, I'm just going to take a run because it's obviously going to take a little bit more time, and the log likelihood is going to be different. And this, it's probably the most reasonable way to model this correlation. Remember, the autoregressive will drop over time to be 0, and that's the end of the story. And then I can go and continue with focusing on what is my main focus, which is this. So we look a little bit of this output. While that is running, notice that I had no plot effect here, because you can also run the autoregressive with a plot effect. And this is an autoregressive, we can almost say this will be the autoregressive plus compound symmetry embedded in it, okay? Let me just, it seems to have converged. Let me just go back to the one that I just did. There is no, you won't see too many difference with the other analysis. You might see a little bit of a drop of the row and the column effects because now things are being modeled all together. But notice this value of 0.78 is the temporal correlation that we have between observations that belong to the same experimental unit when we jump from time, let's say 5 to 6. That's a pretty high correlations if we think about it. They are around 30 days apart. They are not all the time points and all the jumps are the same, so it's an assumption. And again, it's an assumption that it drops with that shape of the autoregressive. Okay, now pretty happy with this model. We can look at the log likelihood value compared to the other one. We'll find this is highly significant. It has a smallest standard error. So this is a really good way to just model this. And I will say a very widely accepted way to model these elements. Okay. Now, the other model that I have here, which is the autoregressive plus compound symmetry, there are some defenders that say you should really not allow that autoregressive to drop and get to 0, but to drop and get to a level which is the compound symmetry level. Because even plants that happen too much over time, let's say a plant happens to be in a very good spot and it grows nicely, that, let's say, positive residual that it has on first harvest is going to still be present through whatever number of harvests you're dealing with, because it's something that affects it positively. It's not that it's going to drop and now it's not going to have that positive effect. So we can test that, and in this case, it happens to have fed it, and I can look at the variance components, and it is, you see here the value from correlation that we have of 0.78 dropped to 0.68, and that's normal because now the decay is a bit less. And also we have a plot effect that happens to be 0.125, not very big, but there is something, and we can see this is the Z value is very likely to be highly significant. I can do a likelihood ratio test, which is actually what I have here. The only difference between this model and the other model is the plot, and it tells me that I have a humongous level of significance for this. So the plot effect is relevant to model this correlation. Okay, I know you probably have lots of questions about it and so on. So you just make sure to bring them here and there. Okay, now I'm going to continue. I could say this is the end of my analysis. I'm not going to worry more about it, and I live with that, and that's very reasonable, and I've done it very often. Now, some people might complain and say, well, you don't have equal intervals. The autoregressive model assumes you have the same jumps, and actually we have a high jump between the first harvest and the second, which is 2 months, and then we have almost 1 month, but we also have that cache of days. So in order to model that lack of equal jumps, we can use the exponential model. The exponential model, I don't have it described here, but here in the power, what you have is the difference between the two time points. So it's the absolute value between the days on harvest 2 minus the days on harvest 1. This is going to be the absolute value between the days on harvest 3 minus the days on harvest 1, and so on. And then you have to be careful that those numbers are not too big, because otherwise the correlation will dissipate to 0 very close. So normally what we do is I do a little trick and I just divide the time point, I divide it by 30.5, and I'm making it as months, okay? So I'm just showing you here that instead of using 0, 67, 96, and so on, I'm dividing everything by 30.5, which is an average a month. And then you have values that are 0, 2.2, 3.1, 4, 5, 6, 7, and so on. You can see they are mostly 1 month jumps, but they are not 1 month jumps. Again, this is a trick for stability. And my only change that I can do here, instead of using AR1H harvest, I'm going to use exponential of my time. But the time here, it's a continuous variable, which is the one I defined it here. In the autoregressive harvest, is just a factor with levels 1, 2, 3, 4 to 11. Okay, so that makes a bit of a difference, but it allows me for these more heterogeneity of the jumps. Okay, now again, this is a bit more purist. You might want to use it. Be aware that often the exponential model has issues converging. Again, the main problem is it's because if that power is too high, everything dissipates to zero too quickly. So you just have to trick it. I could have divided this by 60 and I will have similar results. Now remember, the rho reported for this exponential model is going to be equivalent to one jump, which in my case will be a jump of a month, okay? Which is before to what I have before with the autoregressive, there was a jump of something, 1 unit, whatever we define the unit, okay? So, well, it says it has not converged. Let me just give it a few more little iterations. Again, this model is a little bit more demanding on computing resources. It still doesn't take really that long for these 11 harvests, okay? So, and then I can look at the variance components, and I'll show you that in a sec once we get to the final iterations. So just a couple of seconds. It becomes a little bit unstable, it looks like. So you have, in order to avoid this, sometimes that instability, it's good to provide some starting values, okay? It seems to be improving. It finished. Okay, some variance components. The main thing that you have is this correlation, which is the power. It's the 0.74. Again, it's a correlation, but again, it's a correlation of 1 unit jump. So it's a bit different than what we obtained before. The autoregressive gave me a 7.5. Okay, so that's good. Now let me just compare the different models, and I'm just going to use I can use the log likelihood. They all have the same number of fixed effects. And this is the first model where we have everything independent, not very good. When we model with compound symmetry, better. When we model with autoregressive, even better. When we model this with the autoregressive with a plot effect, even better. And then this is when we do just the exponential. Remember, the exponential also has the plot. So it's failing on something. It's okay. It doesn't really matter too much. My focus is going to be in the autoregressive with the plot. For simplicity, if you want to use the BIC, the better, the higher the better, pardon, the smaller the better. So this one, it tells me that the AR1 with the plot is better, and this AIC tells me something similar, okay? So I'm not going to do too much. Now, I'm going to focus back into the autoregressive with the plots, which we saw the variance component and that correlation of 60.67. Now I'm in a position where I can focus on my fixed effects. And the main thing we might want to do is calculate an ANOVA table. I'm here using a Wald statistics with infinity degrees of freedom. You can request a calculation of degrees of freedom. Sometimes it works fine, sometimes it doesn't work fine. But this is telling me really that I have lots of significance for the harvest, the genotypes, and their interaction, which is not surprising. Everything moves around and so on. My main focus really will be, for example, to get a mean effect, in this case, kind of like an LS mean, or the blue effects of a genotype across all the harvest, okay? You have to be careful that in some cases you won't have the value because some of the genotypes might be missing on some of the harvests. I eliminated some outliers. But again, in the other cases, you'll have a mean that you can say, okay, this is the mean, and you can do some further testing, contrasts, and so on. You can also obtain the means by genotype by harvest. Make sure to have enough memory because now you're requesting a much bigger table that needs to be formed and summarized. And in this case, what you'll have is you'll have the performance of each genotype by harvest. This is important because maybe later on you want to combine some of the early with the later and so on and make an assessment of all of this. Okay, so it does take a little bit of time. So these are just the performance of the genotype 1000 by harvest. Again, we have a missing value. And then this is the fillers, not very relevant. Okay, so as I mentioned, we have other possibilities to model this autoregressive. If we don't have too many harvests, we could change the autoregressive to a core GH. A core GH will allow me for different variances and correlations between different pairs of harvests. So the model will be as simple as just changing on my autoregressive. I will change here, for example, to core H. Now, or core GH actually. Now that will be good, but remember I have a lot of more variance components to estimate. This might not converge very well. An alternative to that might be to use a factor analytic of certain order. If you're familiar with the factor analytic, will approximate that correlation matrix. Again, it's going to still estimate lots of variance components. So if you're not very happy to use too many variance components, you can use less and then get an idea of the structure. All of these are good alternatives. Again, as I mentioned before, my focus is not really modeling this error structure. My focus is allowing for this to have the correct degrees of freedom, the correct standard errors because they are correlated and replicated, so they're not independent, and so on. Okay. So when we do the final analysis, we might want to get, like I showed, the ANOVA, the means per genotype, or we want to focus a little bit on what those variance components are. Okay, and I already showed you this. But what happens if, and this is just a little bit of an extra, and I have a few more minutes. So what happens if in reality I want the genotypes to be random? And this is, again, more typical in breeding. So just move them to be random. Okay, now you can have your model where you have genotype plus genotype by harvest random, but you have to be careful that you have several harvests and the harvests are not independent from each other. So genotype 1, the BLUP value of genotype 1 and harvest 1 will be different than the BLUP value for genotype, the same genotype on harvest 2, 3, and 4. And you actually might be interested in that correlation that describes those. Okay, so you have a lot of options. So in this particular case, what I'm doing, I move the genotype and the genotype harvest here, and I'm modeling the genotype by harvest as a nested effect. So this is pretty much the way we tend to model the G by E, but this is G by year. Notice that I still have the plot effect, and I still have my design effects. I have a mean per harvest, and I'm still modeling my autocorrelation in the same fashion I did before. The only change is here that now I'm saying the genotypes, each genotype, which is an entity, and actually if you have some genomic matrix or pedigree, you can associate this with an A inverse if you want it, and now you use the full genetic elements that you might have. But in this case, I'm saying the harvests are not independent. It's on a by 11 by 11 matrix with a similar logic like this. And I'm going to say, you know, the BLUP values also have a decay with a specific correlation in the similar fashion as we assume with the errors. Now, this doesn't take too much time. Let me just do a little bit of an update. And what you have here again, the model is different. The log likelihood will be all different. This is the temporal correlation between observations that belong to the same plot. And here I have the genetic correlation between BLUP values of the same genotype across harvest. And notice that value is 0.94, very high. It tells me really that there's not many change of rankings. I mean, it's important to know where do they happen, and I guess they happen on the earlier. We can expand that, and these are the different genetic variances for different harvest. So this is allowing for heterogeneous genetic variances, which I can calculate harvest for different ones, and a correlation. Now, this is very important because I'm allowing for that, and eventually I can even calculate overall breeding value for the genotype across all, or breeding value or clonal value or family value across all the harvests or by harvest. Now, once more, the autoregressive for some might be a bit restrictive. And I'm going to say, well, you're assuming equal jumps. We don't have equal jumps. Say, okay, let's do something else. Do I want to use a core GH? It's too much. I'm going to use actually a factor analytic of order 3. And this will give me a little bit more insight also of where that lack of high correlation is happening. Maybe it's just on the first one. Maybe it's on the second one. Maybe it's a few. You can see the model. It's taken a little bit more difficulties on kind of converging. It's asked me for a few more. There's a few components that really are close to 0, and you can repeat this a few times. I just leave it there. It's not big concern because the ones that are changing a lot are actually the ones that have values very close to 0. Okay, but you can play better starting values, a few more cleaning of the outliers will give me that. And my factor analytic, remember the factor analytic, I'm not showing it here, but it's a way to estimate in a simplified way this 11 by 11 matrix of variances of covariances, or variances and correlations. I cannot do that. It's actually 11 times 10 divided by 2. It's a lot of variance components. So what you do is you use different orders of factor analytic, you approximate it, and you can see some of them are 0, and etc. So I'm approximating that matrix. So you get variance components that are really difficult to interpret, but you can construct back the actual matrix of VG, which is the matrix of variance covariance. And I'm just going to show you how it looks. This is an 11 by 11 matrix between the correlations, the variances and the covariances between different pairs of harvests. Notice this is a 0, which is saying that the correlation between 1 and 2 happens to be 0. And we can change that with the cov to core to a correlation matrix. And you can see now correlations, some values are higher, some values are lower. So it's becoming, sorry, this is the CG, which I haven't shown you. I'll show you here. This is the correlation matrix. You can see 0.93, 0.92, 0.97. You can see also, for example, for harvest 4, is highly correlated with 5, but 81, 60, 49, 52, 55, 52. That's the decay I was mentioning. But it's interesting what happens with the harvest 1. The harvest 1 has a correlation of 0, positives and negatives. So really harvest 1, it's a little bit odd. And I'm just going to show you a heat map, and you can see all the bad values are on harvest 1. So really basing our conclusions on harvest 1 is not a very good logic, but you have other harvests that are highly correlated. And this is interesting. Harvest 2, 3, 4, and 5, they seem to be correlated as a group. And then when you go again, 6 and 7 a bit off, but then you have 8, 9, 10, and 11, they seem to be also correlated as a group. And that might help you to define how many real measurements you should really be using on these sort of studies. You maybe don't need all the harvest, because some of the harvests seem to have very high correlations. Look at these ones here, particularly at the end, between each other. So maybe you just decide, I'll stop on harvest 7, and that's the last one I'm going to use, or I'm going to just take every other harvest, and I know that will give me very similar precisions because the correlations are very high. Actually, if you see every other harvest, this one will be correlated with that one, 86. This one will be correlated with that one, 77. So it's still very decent correlations to borrow information, okay? So I can compare the log likelihood between the autoregressive and the factor analytic. You can see the factor analytic is better. It has more variance components. I can do the same thing with the BIC and AIC. Actually, the BIC says the autoregressive is a bit better because it has fewer components. Once more, you can use your model to obtain your predictions. Predictions, these are going to be BLUPs plus the mean of the harvests across the harvests. For each of the genotypes. You can use this to do your ranking, or you can have your predictions by genotype by harvest. So this is again genotype 1000, and this is the predicted value mu plus the BLUP on that specific harvest. So then again, you can decide if you're going to rank them, or you're going to maybe take some averages. So this is what I wanted to show. Actually, I just changed the structure of the table. I made it from being long to be wide. And so this actually tells me for each genotype what is their mu plus BLUP, their predictions per harvest. And then again, you can decide, no, I'm going to ignore the harvest 1, but I'm going to take the average of everything else. And this is perfectly doable with this analysis. Or you might say, what happens with my ranking if I only use the first 4? Against if I have the average across everything. And with that, you can make some decisions that can assist you on how to eventually focus your breeding efforts. and what sort of information you need really in order to make the selection. Now, this is only one trial, and you can see here actually what happens on the final analysis. You also have potentially some stability index to do. That will be nice in the same way we do the MET to see which genotypes seem to be relatively consistent. And you can see, given those high correlations on genetic effects of around 0.7 to 0.9, you can see that the genotypes don't seem to be high. They are more or less consistently on the top. We don't see too much of that crossover. Okay, so just a few last comments. And then I'll open it up for some questions. So obviously we need to focus on modeling the temporal correlation for each experimental unit. Again, you don't have to kill yourselves, just do something to get a better analysis. If you ignore it, you might have some problems. The time trends are, in this particular model that I show you, I didn't model the time trends as a continuous or as a covariant. You can replace time by a continuous variable. I prefer to use it as a factor, and then you allow for that non-linearity that we have this up and down and drop, and also what happens with harvest one, which is quite inconsistent. So our objective obviously is to get BLUPs or BLUP and rank the genotypes. That's where we focus. So we want to do the predictions of genotypes to select across all time points, if that's what we really want to do. And that will be the overall harvest of the genotype, or at different time points, or even do some stabilities and see which genotypes produce more early, which genotype produce more later. So you can do a second sort of data mining or digging in your data. And the variance components give us things. I didn't calculate the heritabilities, and actually I do have the code here to calculate the heritabilities. I think yes. So we can eventually calculate heritabilities across the harvest, and this is by using the previous analysis with the factor or factor analytic over 3. And again, it tells you a little bit more information on where the most value is. Again, this is one study, but we can see again the harvest one seems to be a bit more unstable, and so on. So the variance components again are an important element to help us define what's going on with the data and improve our analyticals and our decisions for phenotyping and so on. A few references, and then I open it up for questions. So,
thanks, Salvador. We've got quite a few questions. First, my apologies. I had to actually nip out during that webinar and do the school pickup. So if these are questions that you've already answered, my apologies.
yeah.
Felician has asked, how do we deal with lack of convergence in these models and singularities when that happens?
So it's going to happen. So usually my recommendation is you have to go with a simpler model. Okay, and sometimes it's like using an autoregressive is the only option because you have no more. A factor analytic of order 1 also sometimes helps. But it's good to identify where the problem is. So your lack of convergence might be maybe you have too many genotypes missing in one of your harvests. And that means there's not enough information to estimate everything. For that same reason, it's good to do the single harvest analysis. The main recommendation is you just start simple, start making it slightly complicated. And if things really don't converge, you kind of like have to stop there and just live with it. Okay?
Great, thank you. And just to say, guys, we've got quite a lot of questions here, some of them quite complex. We're not going to get to all of them today. We absolutely will answer them in the reply email. Another quick one from Santos. What do we do when the timing is actually a year apart across multiple years? How would we manage for that?
And that will be more like the way of using the exponential model. Okay, so that means if the autoregressive has a restriction that assumes your jumps are relatively the same, and as you can see, it's relatively flexible, but these jumps are not too far apart. So I had it like month 2, 3, 4, 7, 8, 9. But if you really go to very big jumps, then you have to go to the exponential. And that's the way. Okay.
time for another one if you're willing.
Yeah,
so somebody has asked why you used 3 in the factor analysis. Can you change 3 to another number, or what's?
Yeah, I can. I managed to illustrate. So a factor analytic of order 1 will be enough to describe something. We don't move too far away from an autoregressive heterogeneous. But the more you put, the more complicated the model is to fit, but the more flexible it gets on describing this correlation between observations. So it was just a balance to have a model that fits. Okay. Starting values are important in all of these models. I didn't use many of these. So maybe some factor analytic of higher order will require also starting values from fits from other easier orders. Okay.
Lovely. Final question. I think this, you might be able to comment on it, but I think it's going to need more explanation. There's a couple of questions around BLUs and BLUPs. One is it better in repeated measurements, which is better under the repeated measurements to interpret the results? And the other is, can you give an example in what case you would be interested in BLUs instead of BLUPs?
So what was the first question? Sorry, I didn't hear well.
So the first question is, are BLUPs or BLUs better when using repeated measurements to interpret the results?
It depends on what you want. I started with BLUs because that is more the traditional repeated measures analysis where the genotype is just a treatment, and our focus is on the ANOVA of the treatments. Remember, those are going to be equivalent to adjustive observations. Now in genetics, we care about the variances, and we'll be using the BLUPs when they make our selections. But it could also be that you're doing a 2-stage analysis, and maybe you want to summarize with BLUs all your multiple harvests into a single value to later on take that single value per genotype, project it to do a GWAS or a genomic selection model, and so on. So it depends on your assumptions and what you really want from this. And the second question was, Carrie?
Second question is, could you give an example of what case when we'd be interested in BLUs instead of BLUPs? Similar sort of question.
Yeah. So you remember specs effects, BLUs, and so on. Yeah. I know there's a lot of more questions, and I'll pick one of them. Do we need an even number of times to do repeated measures properly? For example, we have the data set that each experimental unit was measured only 3 times. Actually, you can do a repeated measures with 2 observations. It will be very easy. But it's probably easier to do a multi-trait or bivariate analysis. So you don't. The nice thing about having, let's say, 3 or even 4 measurements is that you can even go simpler, for example, with the plot effect, with the compound symmetry, and get a very reasonable analysis. Okay, so fewer observations are fine. Now the question becomes when you have, let's say, 125 measurements over time. If you have like a drone or you have something, an automatic machine that goes 125 times, that's 125 harvests, 125 error variances. So a factor analytic in that case is not going to work, and your only solution is to have an AR1H. So a single correlation that you just say, this is going to decay over time, and that's the end of the story. And I use something very simplistic, and also in the genetic part. Okay. So we are running out of time, but we will I'll get to all of your questions, and then as we usually do. And then I expand on some of the other questions too, and then you'll be able to kind of like get to you with your queries. Okay. Anything else?
No, I think we're a little bit over time, so we shall leave it there. Thank you once again, Salvador. Fitted quite a lot into an hour there. Thank you everybody for joining, and we will send you a follow-up email. It will be within 24 to 48 hours. Just bear with us. Thanks again.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye.